welcome to the Berwick Public Library. We have another wonderful presentation. I want to introduce Olga Morrow. And Olga is a 24-year librarian, retired now from library work. But now she's out on a new adventure of research and history. And Olga has fallen upon a forgotten group of people, the Quakers, back in the 1600s. So her book, which is historical fiction based on her research of real facts, takes place in the 1600s with the Quaker community and the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Community College. And we all have learned about the Puritans, I think, but not so much with the Quakers. So, welcome, Olga. And if you want to, give more of your background, that's great. If not
necessary.
Welcome to the Berwick.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and I'm so glad you all came out, even though it's kind of nasty out there today. I'd like to start with a quote from a book by Victor Laval, in which he said, "History is not a tale told once, it's a series of revisions." And I certainly revised my concept of early colonial history in our area, in the Piscataqua region, when I began researching for this book about 5 years ago. It took me 4.5 years to write it, and the first thing that grabbed me, because I was doing this for a prompt with our writers group to write a piece of historical fiction. We were playing around with genres. We thought we'd try historical fiction. So I thought, what do I really want to know about it? And I realized that I knew nothing about the first Europeans who lived in New Hampshire, on New Hampshire soil. It was New Hampshire territory then, soon to become part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But at the time, it was untouched wilderness, basically. The Native Americans used it during the summer, the land during the summer when they came down to the coast. They always went back inland for the winter because it was easier to hunt in the snow. The animals, they had snowshoes, the animals didn't. They could see their tracks, all that kind of thing. So summertime was the time to be by the ocean for the Native Americans, and in the winter they would go right back up country into the mountains and the interiors. But the first Europeans who came to New Hampshire were William and Edward Hilton and a man named David Thompson. And they will be the subject of book 3. This is a trilogy called the Vagabond trilogy. They will be a prequel to these 2 books, which are about the Quaker missionaries, Mary Tompkins and Alice Ambrose. Now, Mary and Alice's story in this book, in book 1, takes place within a year of June 1662 to April or May of 1663. Then book 2 takes over, and because they went south, it is called Vagabond Quaker Southern Colonies, and that covers the next year in their lives. But this book also has a parallel storyline, which is about Richard Waldron. Now the modern spelling is Waldron, but his son is the one who initiated that, not he. So therefore I call him Waldron in the book. Richard emigrated to Dover Point with Captain Thomas Wigan in 1635. So he was there only 2 years after the very first wave of Wigan's recruits, as they called them, came to Dover Point and supplemented what the Hilton brothers and David Thompson had started in 1623. It still was pretty, there was no town, there were a few dwellings and probably some docks and very crude paths. But through Richard's eyes, we see the development of the village on Dover Point. We see the development of his village, which is now where the village of Dover is, which is up on the Kachika River. He started that location of the village himself with a trading post, probably about 1638, 1608. And that became kind of a center around which the now existing village of Dover grew up. So what I would like to know is what your concept from your education is of Puritans. They came to this country, we are often told, for their religious freedom. And they were going to create a city on the hill, as Winthrop put it. He's the one that coined that phrase from the Bible, when he created Boston. And he brought 100 people in 1630 to settle that area and create that perfect place 10 years after the Plymouth people and their disastrous encounter with the wilderness. So what is your concept of Puritans? Just throw out a few words for me.
Inflexible.
Inflexible.
Humorless.
Humorless.
Strict.
Very strict. But I mean, my ignorance was so huge. I had somehow come away from my education thinking that because the Puritans came here for their own religious freedom, they must have allowed that same liberty to other people who came. Not so. See people shaking their heads, you know more than I did. But it was a shock to me to realize that they were so adamant about having these colonies just to themselves. It was just going to be a Puritan stronghold. Now the reason for this is historical context. What was going on in England at that time? Is anybody aware of what was going on in England at that time? In the 1640s, 30s? Well, it was the very strange English Civil War against Charles I. And this was not a war that began at a particular time and then ended. It kind of crept along for a couple of years while they chased Charles around. And then he went to Scotland, and then there was kind of an interim where nothing happened. And then there was another few years where they caught him again, and they were trying to negotiate, and they kept him imprisoned for a few years. And then the final phase of it was actually with his son Charles II. So the English Civil War was not a nice, tidy unit. And it drove a lot of people out of the country, out of England. Puritans left for their religious freedom, but also Royalists left when the Puritans began to dominate because they were having land taken from them, positions taken from them because they were Royalists, and suddenly it was not good to be associated with the king. The king was finally beheaded in 1649. And this unrest had started more than 10 years before he was finally beheaded. So a lot of people were escaping the turmoil of the country. Before he was beheaded, the king was raising taxes like crazy. So economic times were hard. In spite of the fact that it was so long ago, still Europe was beginning to run out of natural resources. And so a place like the Colonies became a real prize. And so you had the Dutch over there in New Amsterdam and all along Long Island in a territory that they called Albania. And then you had John Mason's New Hampshire territory, and you had Ferdinando Gorges's Maine territory. And then you had Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was backed by several strong Puritan kind of like a board like the Dutch had for New Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company. They were looking to make money. It was a commercial venture, even though Winthrop himself was religiously motivated. The whole settlement of Boston was to really get a firm hold in the northern colonies. So that's the context, and there was a huge amount of migration. There was so much migration, I love this little tidbit, that the king started to forbid boats to go. He was losing too many people, and he was still in power. And one of the ships that got turned back had for a passenger none other than Oliver Cromwell.
Teach them a lesson.
Yeah, that'll show, huh? Should have let him go. Imagine how different things would be. Well, the Puritans would have found somebody else to lead the army and, bring everybody together. But it's kind of ironic that the king kept the man in the country who ended up basically being responsible for him losing his head. So that's kind of the political situation at home and why people were so eager, because, oh my gosh, life in the colonies in the beginning must have been so difficult. I really don't see how the Plymouth group ever made it. They arrived in November. They were literally building shelters in the snow. So no wonder half of them died. It's amazing that more of them didn't die. But eventually, so huge migration, 30s, 40s, even the 50s. By the 1660s, when this book opens, the story opens, the children of the original immigrants have now grown up and are marrying and having families of their own. These are the first generation of Americans, really. They were the first ones to know nothing of the mother country, to only know the colonies. And so it's a very interesting time. You have to remember this was before the witch hunts. This is before the Indian Wars even got up to the northern colonies. Because actually the northern colonies did a much better job of negotiating with the Native Americans than either the Dutch or the Virginians. They had much more conflict in the southern colonies with the Native Americans than they did in the northern colonies until the 1670s. So this is about 15 years before that's going to hit, and we get things like the Cochico Massacre, which I'm sure you've probably all heard of, and in which one of our protagonists, Richard Waldron, meets his demise. But that's not in this part of the book. So once they got here, how did the Puritans govern? Anybody have any idea what their government was like? Because I sure didn't.
Church-based, isn't it? Based on the
Definitely,
church.
laws were definitely church-based. Yeah. Yeah.
I first knew about that. I belonged to a congregational church, and
And they were Congregationalists originally, weren't they?
Yes, and our minister told me that people had to support the church. They did not have to belong to it. In fact, they were often not allowed to belong to it, because if the Puritans did not like the politics of the man who wished to become a member, they simply would deny him membership. And then, of course, I read more about their high-handed behaviors toward all people who were not Puritans from your book.
Yes, exactly. The Puritans wanted the colonies for themselves. So they were very picky about who they allowed into their settlements. And they devised this system. Probably there was a similar one in England, and it was called the freeman system. To become a freeman, you were interviewed, and it varied a little bit with the different villages, but in general, you were interviewed by a minister, a magistrate, and your peers, who were the landed gentry of the village, town. So if you didn't pass their tests, you were not voted in as a freeman. If you were not voted in as a freeman, you could not vote, you could not be a member of the church, even if you wanted to. Most of them really didn't. But you still had to go to church. You still had to pay the taxes to support the minister's stipend. You still had to pay the tithes to support his parsonage and the church building, if the town was prosperous enough to have a church building. So, and you had to go. Attendance was mandatory. You were fined if you did not show up at church. And this is regardless of whether regardless if you lived up Oyster River and had to get to Dover Point with your children in the winter, you still had to show up at that church and stay there all day in an unheated building. You maybe got a little break at noon, and then you went back until dark, and then you went home in the dark. So into this very repressive society, in 1656 came the Quakers. Now the Quakers' beliefs were really very basic, not complicated. They believed that all of us have the light of God in our hearts, and that if we just become quiet, that light will blossom in your consciousness and guide you through your life to do the right thing and be kind to people. And it is a direct connection with the divine. So that is why they believed all of us are basically equal, because we all have God within. That's why they wouldn't take off their hats to a magistrate or a minister, which really made them mad. They would not swear an oath, which really made the king mad. And basically, they did not recognize the need for churches or ministers or parsonages. And so therefore, no taxes. So there was a huge economic incentive as well to embrace the Quaker faith. Because, boom, you didn't have to go to church, you didn't have to pay the taxes, you didn't have to support the minister, and you were empowered to have a direct experience with God yourself, which was unheard of. Women could speak. They had women missionaries. This was completely unheard of in this day and age. Women were possessions. You basically bought your wife, or her father paid you to take her, gave you a dowry. And women were not considered good for anything except for having babies. And they were expected by the Puritans to have them every 2 years, like clockwork, until they died, as many of them did. It was not unusual for a man to have 2 or 3 wives, because they just wore them out. It was really not a good time to be a woman. The Quakers were completely different in this. And they were completely different in the way that they practiced their religion and the way that they reached decisions by consensus, which means everybody agrees. Or we sit here and talk about it until everybody agrees. So you can imagine why the Puritans reacted as violently to them as they did do, and they reacted violently in Boston from the very beginning. Governor John Endicott and his minister, Reverend Wilson, and Norton, all of them, 3 of them, made up the Quaker laws. They were not the king's laws. And this was the main thing that the Quakers that appeared before them in court made the legal point of. This is not a king's law. You are doing this law by your own will. This is not right. And we are going to protest these laws no matter what you do to us. Does everybody know that 4 Quakers were hanged in Boston just for being Quakers? They were. They actually got to the point. It began with beating, imprisonment, forced labor, cropping the ear, branding the forehead or the hand, and it graduated to hanging for the 3rd offense because they were banishing them. They just didn't want them there. And the darn Quakers just kept coming back. And they wouldn't stop. It was civil disobedience of the first order.
Where are they coming from, Olga?
England.
From England?
Yes, and Barbados. A lot of them came. It was sometimes easier with the way the winds were, depending on the time of year, to go from England to Barbados and then up to the colonies. And there was so much trade between the colonies and Barbados and England. In fact, at one point, the King's Navigation Acts made it so that the colonies could not trade with anybody but English ships and English ports, like Barbados or England. But a lot of the missionaries came through Barbados, so there was a huge community of them in Barbados as well. But they were the ones that were keeping the Bay Colony from becoming a bunch of old fuddy-duddies that just did not welcome anybody that wasn't like them. So I think in terms of the credit that I used to give to the Puritans for laying the groundwork for our American ideals of equality and religious freedom, it wasn't the Puritans. If they'd had their way, there wouldn't have been religious freedom. And there certainly wouldn't have been equality of the sexes. So the Quakers were really the ones that were propounding those very American ideals that we had. And nobody seems to really know that, or they don't seem to be getting the credit for that. So I hope, in my own small way, that this book will help to set the record straight on that. They really had some pretty, the Puritans had some pretty quirky ideas, and they believed them totally. The reason their punishments were so brutal was because they thought that if someone did something wrong, like stealing something or even slandering somebody, if they were not punished, God would come and punish the whole community, that everyone would suffer. And therefore they had to do this in order to appease God's wrath. And that's why they had these extremely brutal punishments. They used them all the time for the stupidest, slightest things. Really, I mean, you could just say, "Thou knave, thou scurvy knave," and you'd be flogged. 15 stripes if you're a man, 10 stripes if you're a woman. You couldn't even have a domestic dispute without the whole neighborhood getting in on it. They had something called the neighbor watch, which is just what it sounds like. It was kind of like Nazi Germany. If you don't like your neighbor, just tell the authorities they're a Jew, and they'll get taken away. Well, in colonial times, just tell them they're a witch, or tell them that they spooked your cow, or they stole something, or a lot of court, a lot of litigation went on in Puritan times. I think it might have almost been a form of entertainment. Just think about it. They didn't have a whole lot to do once they stopped working. I mean, there was a lot of labor to do, but it wasn't a whole lot of amusement. Also, funerals. I just thought Puritans did funerals like we did. Put somebody in a box, say a few words about them, bury them. No, they didn't. They put them in the box, but they didn't say anything. There was no minister. There was no service. There was interment, and the week before they interred the body, everyone that had known the deceased was encouraged to write a poem or a little etching or an anagram using their name or some kind of tricky, creative thing like that. And they would have these cards printed up, and they would distribute them throughout their social circles. And the competition was fierce for who was the most original, or who was the funniest, or who was, whatever, the most creative. And they were allowed to drink. It was the only time alcohol was allowed. When somebody died, you could get drunk as a skunk. In fact, they had a committee that made up the punch. It was very important. It was very important. I know we laugh about it now, but to them it was as serious as all get out. So at one point in the book, I could not find a description of John Winthrop's funeral. He died in 1649 as well, just after the king was beheaded. And so I kind of used my imagination and made up his funeral procession to King's Cemetery to inter him. But the party the night before and the day after are really not what we would think a Puritan funeral would be about. It's really quite fascinating. Also, holidays. Such religious people, don't you think they must have just honored Christmas like crazy? No. They banned Christmas. Christmas was pagan as far as they were concerned. And it was frivolous, and it was popish. And so you went ahead and worked on Christmas. And if anyone was caught feasting or making merry, they were fined. And I have the law in the book. I actually copied it verbatim because I knew nobody would believe me if I didn't put it in there. So let me see. Does anyone have any questions about anything?
I'd like to make a couple of comments if I could.
Sure.
First of all, when I was growing up and until I read this book, I thought of a Puritan as being somebody who had purity in spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And that would mean to me godliness, which probably it was their interpretation of godliness, which is not my interpretation. But also it's very interesting to me that we do not have Puritans anymore. We have Congregationalists. I belong to a Congregational church. I find it a very, I'll call it an easygoing church, one who accepts all sorts of people, is not judgmental and so forth.
Yes.
And also the Quakers have survived. I also belonged to a Quaker church at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it interesting that the overpowering attempts that the Puritans had didn't do any good for them? Now we have Congregationalists and Quakers.
Yeah. Yeah. No, ultimately, you really can't be exclusionary. It was a very exclusionist society, both in the freeman system and in their church membership. I mean, 2/3 of the people in these villages were not freemen. 2/3, more than half. It was very inequitable. But the Puritans believed from the Bible that they were meant to lead and other people were meant to serve them. And it was ordained by God. So they had no qualms about living that way. No qualms whatsoever. Very, very different from the Quaker attitude. So Rhode Island was really the only colony where one could find religious toleration of any kind. And the other colonies were furious with Rhode Island. And the thing is, Rhode Island was started by Puritan people who left Boston because they were banished by Winthrop. It was the whole antinomian issue with Anne Hutchinson. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of that. But she merely started discussion groups with the other women in the village. And eventually they got so popular that the ministers were threatened. And then her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, gave a very inflammatory service, which he really probably should not have done in retrospect, but in a way it was a good thing, because that was the straw that broke Winthrop's back. And eventually he and Anne and 70 people with them were banned from Boston. And a few of them went north. Wheelwright started Exeter, New Hampshire, when he left Boston. And Anne Hutchinson and her followers, including William Coddington, who was a very well-known old Rhode Islander, all went south, and where Roger Williams had gone the year before, because Roger Williams had just been banished the year before that from Salem. He was the minister at Salem. And he was too radical for them. So they followed Roger, and he helped them to negotiate with the Indians and get Aquidneck Island, which is where they settled. And they started at the top of Aquidneck with Portsmouth. And then they had another rift between that group and Coddington and William Dyer and some of his followers. They went south and started Newport for a settlement. But they always allowed religious toleration in Rhode Island, and that drove the other colonies nuts. And everybody had border problems. you can imagine. I mean, the surveying then, I don't even know what they had for surveying instruments, but I know they had Nicholas Shapley and Richard Waldron survey the boundaries of Dover and Kittery, respectively. But the boundaries between Plymouth and Massachusetts, between Plymouth and Rhode Island, between Connecticut and Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island were always in contention, just always. And now I'm finding with the research for book 2 that it was that way with Maryland and Virginia as well. So the border issues, you had to have that charter, that royal charter from the king that delineated where your territory was bounded, by what it was bounded. And then you had a leg to stand on, but otherwise everybody was just grabbing land all over the place, wherever they could, especially as more and more people were coming in to the colonies. So it changed enormously, as you will see if you read the book, from when Richard first got there in the 1630s and the 30 years later in the 1660s. It's just basically a couple of generations, but huge, huge difference. If you don't have another question, I'd like to read you the original warrant that Richard Waldron set for Mary and Alice, my protagonists, when they were arrested at Dover. And this is what first caught my attention and made me want to write this book, because I just could not believe that this sentence would have been legal and passed. Here it is, verbatim. To the constables of Dover, Hampton, Salisbury, Newbury, Rowley, Ipswich, Wenham, Lynn, Boston, Roxbury, Dedham, and until these vagabond Quakers are carried out of this jurisdiction, you and every one of you are required in the King's name to take these vagabond Quakers, Ann Coleman, Mary Tompkins, and Alice Ambrose, and make them fast to the cart's tail, and driving the cart through your several towns, in each town to whip them on their bare backs, not exceeding 10 stripes each on each of them, and so convey them from constable to constable until they come out of this jurisdiction, Massachusetts Bay Colony, as you will answer it at your peril. And this shall be your warrant at Dover, dated December 22nd, 1662, per me, Richard Waldron. That's 11 towns, a distance of over 80 miles, and it was December. I was just amazed.
Did you think that that meant once they were whipped, they had to continue to walk
No.
through all those?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I do not. I think they conveyed them from one town to the other. When they got to the town, they tied them to the back of an ox cart and whipped them, walking around the town common or down the main street or whatever, but not walking all that. No, nobody could do that, especially in winter. I mean, they could hardly they didn't take an ox cart from Dover. They actually, because the snow was so deep, they got Waldron to change it and let them put the women on horses. And of course they kept falling off and sliding off every time the men put them up on the horse. So they just, were conscientiously objecting already to the situation by they didn't struggle, they didn't fight them, but they would just go limp. As soon as the constables touched them, started to take them to the jail or anything, they would just fall down on the floor. So the constables had to deal with dead weights that were not helping them at all. And so therefore the second incident becomes even more brutal, because it's the same constables, they're sick to death of it, and they drag the women out into the snow and drag them for over a mile and throw them into a root cellar, keep them there overnight, and then they try to take them out in a boat and throw them into the river. And this is January. So they really intended to kill them. They really, really did. And I think that warrant meant to kill them. But something happens. You'll have to read the book to find out. You know. Would you like to hear the Berwick part?
Yes.
Just a little of the beginning chapter. I call it People of the Falls is the chapter. Mary and Alice have spent the whole summer with the Shapleys, organizing mercy wagons, and a third, Ann Coleman, joins them in October, another missionary. And they all go up the river with Thomas Spencer and Richard. I'm having a senior moment here. Richard Spencer and
Was it Edward?
no, it was Richard and Thomas, and I'm just spacing out on their names. It was Thomas Spencer and Richard Nason. And they were staying, Richard's wife is ill, because in doing the research and looking up his family to see how many children he had and how old they were and all that stuff so it could write their home, it turned out his wife died in 1663, or 62. And I went, oh, my goodness, I'm gonna have to change that. So this is their first evening after they've come upriver with Richard and Thomas in their skiff. And they've just had dinner and they're sitting on the porch with Thomas, and after dinner, and it's late October, okay? We cannot know how long this river has flowed past these banks before ever we were present, Thomas Spencer said through a cloud of tobacco smoke from his pipe. And I reckon 'twill flow long after we are gone. The three missionaries were sharing a quiet moment with their host after dinner. The evening was windless and mild for the end of October. They could hear the roar of the falls from across the dark field. Lamplight shone through the windows of the porch where they sat rocking. The summer night chorus had quieted since the recent killing frosts, but a few brave crickets sang from beneath the porch. I sit here often of an evening, and it causes me to ponder, their host continued, removing the pipe from his mouth and staring off toward the point where the Asbenbedik, how do you pronounce it? Asbenbedik? Do you know? Anybody?
No.
Asbenbedik River split off from the Nuuchwanak. Nuuchwanak. Thank you. Hard to know. We have seen prodigious changes here in 30 years. How much more shall it be altered in another 30? I shall not see the century turn, I reckon, he mused. When didst thou settle here, friend Nason? Allie asked. 'Twas 1630, he answered, puffing. I was just 24. Came on the Warwick with Ambrose Gibbons and Roger Knight, hired by John Mason. There was nothing here then but the river, virgin pine, and the old fields. The fragrant pipe smoke curled above their heads and drifted out into the windless night. Gibbons was here first, chose a fine location for a house on a rise just north of the Asbenbedik. The Great House, he called it. And it was large enough for all of us, at least at the first. The Indians proved curious about our activities and were more welcoming than we had hoped. Their Sogmo, Rowles, sold us this land, so long as his people could continue to grow corn and fish here. The old fields were their traditional planting grounds, you see. For a time, we employed near 100 natives to plant corn each season. And we cleared more land for our own crop as well. Verily, they helped us. In those years, so many salmon came upstream in spring, the river was thick with them. At times, they overflowed the banks and spoiled, but the natives buried them to nourish the corn hills, an ingenious use of the waste. They don't run the river anymore, though, the salmon. Not since Richard Leader renovated that old sawmill back in '50. He brought a group of Scots with him when he came up from Saugus Ironworks. Friend Furbish was one of them. Many of those men made a good start here, working leaders' saws. Betimes 20, cutting all at once. An irksome noise that was. Thomas chuckled and knocked his pipe against the railing. He showed us how 'twas done, did Leader, though he did not stay long. Eventually we built our own. Humphrey Chadbourne, my wife's brother, and I. Our son-in-law, Dan Goodwin, threw in with us too in time. The sawmill is just across the field there, Thomas pointed with his pipe stem. The women were fascinated by this glimpse of early settlement. Did thy wife come with thee? Anne asked. Not at the first. Patience and I were newly wed, and 'twas a hardship to part. But she joined me in the next year, along with the wives of Gibbons and Knight. We were a small company, just 10 of us. We all lived at the great house until Mason sent the joiners in '34. My father-in-law, William Chadbourne, was one of them. John Mason hired him and 2 others to build a water-powered sawmill. They brought a model. It started early in July. It took them all summer to build, but it soon became evident that the practical application was trickier than anticipated. He smiled and shook his head. We knew nothing then, and parts kept breaking from the force of the water. 'Twas a trial to mill the boards of consistent thickness. And then the next year Mason died, and all his great plans of mills and mines and vineyards soon gave way to more practical concerns, like building homes. No wages were ever likely to come to us with Mason gone. On the other hand, here was a land where a man might carve out his own kingdom. We all opted to stay, pay or no. Father Chadbourne built this very house and gifted it to Patience and me. And none too soon, for we had 3 little ones by then. Thomas chuckled, and then sobered, adding, he was a fine man, and we mourn his loss yet. The door opened, and the sudden illumination broke the spell. Patience stood there with Joy in her arms. I bid you good night, she said to the missionaries. No, no, do not disturb yourselves, she added as they began to rise. 'Tis just the babe wants feeding and a good sleep. Ye share the bedchamber upstairs with Lizzie and Gwen, she went on, referring to the Spencer's daughter and a young niece who lived with them. They will settle you in once you're ready to retire. They're just cleaning up. Oh, then we should help, said Allie, making to rise. No, I shall not countenance that. Patience smiled. They are nearly done, and ye are newly arrived. Rest now. I promise we shall work you hard on the morrow. And I promise we shall hold thee to that, Allie answered, smiling back. Joy began to fuss. Ah, my mistress bids me get on with it, Patience said, giving the baby's downy head a quick kiss. Sweet rest then, and welcome to our home. So that's the beginning of the river people and people of the falls. But it was a very successful enterprise eventually because of the pine up this way. And they just floated right down the river to Portsmouth. And they had special ships. They just float the logs into the hold of the ship from the water. So they did very well up here in Berwick, in Old Berwick. And they made pipes, they made staves for barrels. So you had pipe stave landing. Any questions?
Maybe Roseanne knows. Isn't it Humphrey Chadbourne's place that they've been doing a lot of archaeological digs through the South Berwick Historical Society?
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you all recognize some of those old names, those family names. And there's a great map in here, too, that we redrew from an old map of Berwick, just putting in the major characters and the major places in the old village. It's at the end of the People of the Falls chapter.
Are the people of the falls, were they Quakers?
They were going to become Quakers with Mary and Alice there. Yeah,
Okay.
Mary and Alice were there because Thomas and Richard Spencer had asked them to come and establish regular meetings. So they were going up to the settlement that became Berwick. I don't think it was even called Berwick yet. And they were establishing regular meetings. They didn't have an ordained minister up there. It was too far upriver, and they didn't have the money to pay him. So, yeah.
But they were fined for not,
They were fined if they didn't show up. Yeah, they were fined if they didn't show up. Then I don't know if they had to go all the way to Dover. They probably did. They probably had to go all the way to Dover. But, you know, then it was also a matter of who was going to go up there and get the fines from them. So, you know, a lot of the strictness and the rules kind of relaxed a whole lot as you got further away from the centers of where there was a church and an ordained minister.
and many of them came north for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. And I make that point early on in the book too. For a while before New Hampshire became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was 1642, before that happened, New Hampshire was definitely a place where people who wanted to get out of Boston or get away from the Puritans, they came, and Salmon Falls and up the river as well.
Live free or die.
Yeah, live free or die, exactly. Even
Mostly
then.
died.
So, how are we doing on time? Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned I don't know if it was a colony, but it seems to me it was of the same mass. Fernando Gorges and
Maine, yeah,
yes,
he owned the
and
Maine territory.
I lived in Portland many years in the area, and we have there is an old fort out in the harbor named Fort Gorges.
Probably was
But
named for him.
We
Yeah.
don't hear much about anything.
No, he
up
was
there.
a mover and shaker. He was captain of the fort at Plymouth, England. And he took David Thompson in as a ward when David's father died, when David was 11. This is going to be book 3. But it's all, you know, really, all the major events in my books are true. The only thing I make up is connecting them and people's relationships to each other and characters. You know, of course, you know, you kind of take what they did and try to figure what the character was, but sometimes you go with what makes a good story too. But the major events and the major occurrences are all real. And Ferdinando Gorges was one of the foremost in trying to establish a northern colony, you know, settlement. It took them a long time. You know, Jamestown was started in 1607. They didn't get to Plymouth till 1620. They tried though. They did up the Kennebec, where Fort St. George is. That was actually a settlement that they tried to establish a permanent. You know, they sent 100 people. They sent women, children, men. They built a huge fort. They built a ship, the Virginia of Sagadahoc, because the river was called the Sagadahoc at that point, not the Kennebec. And unfortunately, their leader died. Otherwise, they would have stayed. They were doing fine. Nobody died except the leader. It wasn't like Jamestown, where, you know, they all got malaria from the mosquitoes and starved and stuff. No, it wasn't like that at all. But, you know, that was about 1607. And that's going to be in David Thompson's book. So, all those early attempts. I never realized, you know, I thought, well, if they sent a group to settle, they just went and they did it, right? No. They could get blown off course, they could get captured by the Spanish or the Dutch, because England was at war with both of those countries at that time. And all kinds of things could happen to them. So, they tried, yeah.
I just want to say I have read your book, and I think it's a wonderful book, especially for older children as well as adults, especially in this area, because we don't have much telling the story.
Exactly.
And I think it's a good book that will incite people to then go and look up more information, like you did, in order to facilitate their knowledge of these peoples. It was just a wonderful book to read and to.
Thank you.
Because I knew, you know, the names.
Yeah.
They were right there, and I said,
Yeah.
wow, you know, and I know it's, you know, historical fiction, but still.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, the trials that they went through, especially these ladies. I mean, it's.
Yeah, that all really happened.
It's horrendous, yeah.
Yeah.
And it really did happen, and I think children, and young adults need
Yeah,
to
if we
know
leave out
about
the
it.
chapter about the barroom, you could do, it would be a fine book for children.
Roseanne is very
Yeah.
modest. She's a Shapley descendant.
Oh, great.
I'm one of those, yeah.
Oh, well, I spoke at one of the Shapley reunions before this got published,
Yeah.
over in Maine, near where we lived there, a couple or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
My dear friend Carol Ford asked me to speak for the
Ah.
family, and it was so much fun.
Very
Because they were enthusiastic like you are, because they were related to the people that are in this book. And that's really, I wrote this book for the people in this area so that we would all know what our history is. These people walked here. I go to Kittery Point now and I think, Nicholas Shapley walked this ground. It's just staggering to me. It's so wonderful to know that. Thank you.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I just had one question.
Sure.
I mean, it's kind of amazing, the hypocrisy of the Puritans coming here and becoming so rigid and thinking that only they, are the chosen ones or whatever. And then the Quakers, who also wanted religious freedom, were ostracized, banished, etc., or worse.
Yep.
How did they develop amnesia?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know why this information has been omitted from our educational system. I think maybe it became, the image of the Puritans was kind of crafted in the 1800s when Thanksgiving came into vogue, and this whole thing about the friendly Indians and the pumpkins and the turkeys and all this stuff. I think it was too hard to explain why those 4 people were hanged in Boston. How will we explain that to the children? We'll just put it under the rug. So much easier. I don't know. Who makes those decisions? Who makes those decisions about textbooks? I don't know. But I did have a history teacher in one of my programs from Kingswood High School who said he had doubted that when I said in the PR that this was hidden history. And he went back to his old texts and he looked through them and he went, oh my gosh, the only thing that this information is in is my advanced placement text. It was not in any of his regular history books. So.
Well, let's face it, they have to skip a lot of history to get through that
Oh, they do.
few years.
They do. And it must be hard, to make those decisions. But I think this was a mistake to leave this out. And that there should be a whole separate course study of Quakers and Puritans in the 1600s. There's just so much information there.
And the Pilgrims were a different sect as well.
Yeah, and the Pilgrims weren't necessarily Puritans.
Right.
That's right. Quite a few of the people that came with the Puritans were not of their religious bent. Yeah.
So were there pilgrims, let's say in England, or were they called pilgrims once they decided to emigrate?
I think a pilgrim has always been a religious seeker.
Okay.
Pilgrim's Progress, that old chestnut. Pilgrims, you go on a pilgrimage. You are seeking some kind of spiritual enlightenment. But I think the way we use it in America, it's more those other people that were with the Puritans. And they were pilgrims in a way because God knows why they came in November. I don't know. I do know. Their sister ship kept springing leaks. Speedwell kept springing leaks, and they kept having to go back. And they were trying to stay together, so it delayed, the Mayflower so much that by the time they finally gave up on the Speedwell and came by themselves, it was November when they got here. And they didn't really know how long it took to cross the Atlantic at that point. It was one of the earlier voyages. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I would be happy to sign a book for you if you'd like to buy one. Thank you. The library owns it as well, so if you don't
We
mind waiting,
do.
you can borrow it.
You can.